Today we are looking at God's grace and generosity. In this book of 1 Samuel and the story of David, the first week we looked at it, we talked about how the story of David really just fits into the greater story of God, that God is establishing his reign, God is establishing his rule. You see that from Genesis 1. That's what God was doing. He was establishing his reign and rule on all the earth. What you see in Genesis 3 is rebellion against God, a turning from God, sin entering the world, things not going as they are intended to go. We all experience this every day. We see the same pattern here with the establishing of a king. Saul was supposed to be king. He turned from God. He made it about himself. He brings destruction and devastation. Actually, as chapter 30 is happening, in chapter 31, Saul is in a battle, and he actually takes his own life. So it's 31 and 30 are happening at the same time, and it's the end of Saul, and again, kind of the demise of Saul, which we have been seeing, and the rise of David, the establishment of David as God's king. So that's kind of where we are in this greater story, the establishment of David as king. But it's interesting, and you can see in this passage throughout, David is a very divided person. We talked about this again in the first week. One commentator called him like David the Great. He's like the mightiest warrior that the people of God have had. He was a powerful king. Just to like make everybody jealous, he was a great poet. So not only could he fight, he like wrote love songs. So he kind of did it. He did it all. And it says that he was a man after God's own heart. So in the scriptures, this is all true. He's very powerful. God uses him in mighty ways, but he's also divided. He is also very wicked and sinful, and even very ordinary. One commentator, as one called him David the Great, another one called him David the Runt. He was like the little brother, like literally that's how they described him. He's the runt. He's the one that's left behind. He's the lowly shepherd, which is like we have cute songs about that. That was like the lowliest position you could have. Like God's saying like, hey, I am going to pick the one who is the lowliest, who is the weakest, who is discarded, and that's the one I'm going to use. That's who I'm going to establish my kingdom through. And even after that idea of David, after a man of God's own heart, like he turns into a murderer. He's an adulterer. He rebels against God. So like it's a very complex character, a complex person, which is super helpful because we all are. And so for us to find ourselves in the story of David and in the story of God. Even as we lead into chapter 30, last week we talked about David had the courage to stand up to Saul, to come out and say, hey, why are you attacking me? Why are you coming from me? So he was kind of heroic in chapter 24. Chapter 25, there was a powerful kind of landowner who David thought he should give him some stuff. The guy's like, who are you? I'm not giving you anything. Made David mad, so he goes and tries to kill him. Okay? So he goes from sparing Saul to trying to kill Nabal, and then Abigail kind of stops him from that. So even leading into chapter 30, in chapters 27 to 29, there's no mention of God at all. So David has kind of like walked away from God, rebelled from God. He's not a man after God's own heart in the midst of this. Where we find him, he was actually with the Philistine army going to march to fight Saul and the Israelites. He was going to fight the people of God. So David has kind of strayed away from God. He's moved from God. He's in rebellion against God. And what we'll see today is how God's grace transforms and leads to generosity. How God's grace transforms David, and how God's grace can transform us and lead us to be changed, but also lead us to be generous people. And we'll look at David as a recipient of grace. We'll look at David as being provided for, and then David becoming a gracious and generous person. But what we see in verses 1 through 6 is, first of all, David is a recipient of grace. Again, David was with the army, with the enemies of God, going to fight the people of God. And then one of the commanders of that army said, like, hey, isn't he an Israelite? He can't go. He can't go and fight this battle. So they actually get sent back to where they had been. They get sent back to Ziklag. And that's where their wives and that's where the children were. And so that's what we find. It says they go back to Ziklag. It says, now when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, the Amalekites had made a raid against the Negeb and against Ziklag. They had overcome Ziklag and burned it with fire and taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. It says, but they killed no one, but carried them off and went their way. I feel like this is the first sort of like evidence of grace. David was marching, doing his own thing, going against the people of God, and God's providence wouldn't let him go any further. He goes back to his people. He goes back to where the wives and children were. And do you ever happen to you like, hey, I got these plans, I got these things to do, and then they just don't happen? You're like, that's maybe some of like we had plans Thursday. Hurricane was coming. Kids are home. Plans are now changed, right? They didn't go as planned. But it was God's grace that they actually got back. Because they got back and they found that it had just been caught on fire. They had taken their wives and children. If they would have gone to war, they would never have known that. But they go back, and since they did know that, they immediately go and search for them. Because what they would have done, it says that they didn't kill them. Like, that's another good thing. David had actually killed the towns that he had raided. They didn't kill them, but what they would have done is, like the story of Joseph, they would have sold them into slavery. So their wives, and they weren't keeping them because they were like nice people. They were keeping them so they could sell them into slavery. So they would never seen their wives and children again. But they go back, God brings them back, and they discover that they had been raided. They took the women and children. The place had been burned to the ground. And rightly, they were upset. Verse 4, it says David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. This sort of shows the David divided sort of thing. It says David's two wives, that's not how the Bible does it. His two wives had also been taken captive. And it says in verse 6, and David was greatly distressed. It says the people were bitter in soul. What happens, and Eugene Peterson talks about this, is catastrophe brings out either the best in us or the worst in us. And what we'll see in this account is the men, the sort of company, the army of David, respond to this in one way, and then we see David to respond to it in another way. They respond in vastly different ways. So the same bad thing happened to both of them, correct? They all had their wives and their children taken from them. They all had their stuff burned and destroyed. But what the army does, they seek to take matters in their own hands. And it says that David was greatly distressed, not only because he lost his wives and children, but in verse 6 it says, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. They want to take matters in their own hands. When something horrific happens, when there is catastrophe, we get angry, we get bitter, and then we look for somebody to blame. Correct? Something bad happens, immediately we want to blame somebody and make them pay for it. I always need to start this story with she is fine. But when Alana was a little girl, we had like 3 kids under 4. And so I was getting ready to go. Karina happened to be like really sick, really, really sick, like can't get out of the bed sort of sick. And so I was going to take this 3 kids and dog on our run, which the 2 older ones ride the bike. I push Weston in the sort of like jogging stroller, and then I have the dog. I don't know why I thought this was a good idea, but I did, and that was my regular routine. So I'm getting Weston all strapped in. The kids, we had kind of a circle drive, and so they were driving around the circle on their bikes, waiting for me to get going. Alana comes out, and a car comes and hits her. And she just goes straight onto the hood of the car, and then just like slowly falls off. Now, she was fine, but everybody, so neighbors comes out, fire trucks, the whole deal. And everybody's like, first they're kind of looking at me like, why are you letting her do that? And then they're mad at the driver, like, why were you going? And I was like, she wasn't going fast, she was fine. They're like, oh, the bushes were too high, or this street shouldn't be a street. Like, they were blaming and mad at everybody. And I'm like, actually, nobody did anything wrong. She's just a little girl riding her bike. Actually, the lady, she was going down to a house at the bottom of our street. She was going to clean the house. She felt so distraught. She just started, she's like, will you pray for her with me? And I was like, yes, I will pray for my daughter with you. We started praying for her. Got her there. She became friends. She just started stopping at her house like every month when she would go. She became friends with her. It was nobody's fault. There was nothing wrong. But when bad things happen, we want to blame. We want to find the source. We want somebody to pay. And that's what was going on here. These people had lost their wives, they had lost their children, they had lost all their stuff, and they wanted somebody to pay. They had a strategy. Eugene Peterson says it this way. He says, the company had a strategy, but it was conceived in bitterness. That's where a lot of our strategies, that's where a lot of our ways that we approach life go. They're conceived in bitterness, and their strategy was, let's kill David. It's his fault. He was leading us. He's to blame. If he wouldn't have had us do this, our families would be here. Peterson says there's an enormous amount of outrage in the world that's converted into angry plans of attack and destruction. I'll read that one again just because it's true. There is an enormous amount of outrage in the world that's converted into angry plans and attack and destruction. He says a great deal of social action and political reform is fueled by anger. The results are nearly always worse than the conditions that provoked the action. It's true. When we go at things in bitterness, when we go at things in anger, it makes things worse. It's the reality that we all face. Peter says, if we're going to do something about what's wrong with the world, and he says, and the spectrum of wrong stretches from marital fights to world wars, so from little things at our house to wars around the world, from disobedient children to the destruction of rainforest, he says we have to acquire a better base to work from than our anger. We live in a world, we live in a culture that is fueled by anger. Everybody can look around and say, hey, things aren't right. Things aren't the way they're supposed to be. We need to do something about it. But you get two different results. If you go at it in bitterness and anger, it's just going to lead to more destruction, more division, more devastation. We see it everywhere. And that's the propensity of our hearts. That's the propensity of the world, is to respond in anger, to seek blame, to want revenge. And this is how the company wants to respond. But we see David responds in a different way. In the midst of catastrophe, David wakes up, if you will. He wakes up and turns back to the Lord, who strengthens him. Peterson goes on, he says, catastrophe brought out the best in David. In the chaos of lamentation, anger, bitterness, with storm clouds of murder rolling across the horizon, we come to this wonderful line. It says, but David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. So again, he was going through all the same things. He was angry, he was lamenting, he was bitter, he didn't know what to do. But it says that he turned back to God. He turned towards God. It says David prayed, David worshiped, David called on his pastor, Abiathar, for counsel. It says that David went deep within himself. He met with God and found strength and direction to, I love this, to stride into the way of salvation. Instead of bringing more destruction, instead of bringing more division, instead of bringing death, he strode into the way of salvation and life and restoration. And as his exterior collapsed, he returned to his interior, rebuilt his primary identity, and recovered his base. The moment of disaster freed him. And he came out from the place of quietness and counsel and prayer with a plan. So anger is just going to lead to more violence, more division, more destruction, and ultimately death. It's what we see in Saul in chapter 31. Again, we're getting kind of a parallel account. Even Saul grew more angry, he grew more violent, he brought more destruction, and it ultimately led to his death. David turned to prayer, he sought counsel, and he made a plan to rescue the lost women, the lost children, to recover their stuff. David turned to the Lord, and what it brought was salvation, restoration, life. We see two aspects of the grace of God in this. The first is that David turned back to God. He had gone through this period. It's probably a long window, because he had enough to make friends, go in war, stuff like that. He had gone through a long period of indifference, disregard, blatant rebellion against God. Right? We've all had those seasons. I had a long season of that. I was probably 8. We were connected at a church, went to the school, did the thing, and then just nothing. Disregard for God. Believed there was a God. Had zero implications on my life until I was 26. Right? And then there's a turning to God. Now, some of you, that's a long window like that. Others, it's it could be weeks, it could be months. God, I'm gonna do things my way. Kind of over all of it. I'm overwhelmed. I don't know what to do. It's not going good anyway. But we see the grace of God is that David turns back to him. In his moment of need, he turns to God. And then the second evidence of grace is that it says that God strengthens him. David's rebellion, David's murder, David's going against the people of God, what does God extend to him? His grace, his mercy, his compassion. He doesn't say, too late, David. It says that he strengthened himself in the Lord his God. It means that God strengthened him. This is a lot like the parable of the two sons, or the prodigal son, where the son has turned from the father, did things his own way, took his inheritance, rebelled. Then he realizes kind of where he is in life. And he's like, hey, things were a lot better with my father. Things were a lot better at home. And so he comes home. And he finds the father going towards him, accepting him, loving him, throwing him a party. Whenever we turn from God, whenever we're indifferent towards God, whenever we feel like we've gone too far from God, the answer is always, don't go further. It's to turn. Turn to him, trust in him, rest in him. He loves, he accepts, he extends grace. He's merciful. I love it, even these Psalms of David that we're reading for our call to worship and our corporate prayer. He continually comes back and talks about the steadfast love and faithfulness of God. He needed to remind himself of that every day. And we need to remind ourselves of that every day too. Because the tendency is for us to think that we've gone too far, that God can't forgive it, that it doesn't matter. But when David experiences the grace of God, when he's the recipient of grace, he also realizes that God will provide for. We see David is provided for by God. So not only does he get a plan, he's strengthened by God, he turns to God and asks him. And it says that David recovered everything. So David is strengthened by God, and then he goes to God. We saw this a few weeks ago when we talked about the guidance of God. He goes to God in prayer. It says, David said to Abiathar, the priest of the son of Elimelech, bring me the ephod. That's like the prayer garment. So Abiathar brought the ephod to David, and David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue after this band? Shall I overtake them? And he answered, pursue, for you shall surely overtake and shall surely rescue. So David set out, and the 600 men who were with him, and they came to the brook of Besor, where those who were left behind stayed. We'll come back to that. It says, but David pursued, and he and 400 men, 200 stayed behind, who were too exhausted to cross the brook of Besor. David consults the priest. He gets people around him. He seeks God through prayer. And then he is reminded of God's promises. He says, surely you will overtake them. Surely you will rescue your people. David trusts in the providence of God. He trusts in the plans of God. He prays, he gets people, and then he has rest because he trusts in God and his promises. He trusts God even when they lose 200 men who were just too exhausted to go. They would have walked like 60 miles in just a couple of days. So it wasn't like these guys were like, look at the soft ones over there. They can't make it. No, like they did like 2 marathons, right? And they're like, hey, we can't go anymore. David doesn't use them. David doesn't ridicule them. He leaves them. He's like, hey, you actually have a role to play. You watch the stuff. You have a part to play. And also, this is a sign that David would be provided for. It's kind of like the story of Gideon, who goes in with a small amount of people. So David going in with lesser people is a reminder that God said he would provide for them. And it's not the size of their army. It's not their power. It's not their strength. It's God's power. It's God's strength. He will bring the victory. So even losing 200 of the men isn't going to stop God's plans. And then we see that God provides again. It says that he happens to run across this Egyptian slave. It says they found an Egyptian in the open country and brought him to David. And they gave him bread and he ate, and they gave him water to drink. And they gave him a piece of cake and figs and 2 clusters of raisins. And when he had eaten, his spirit revived, for he had not eaten bread or drunk water for the 3 days and 3 nights. We'll come back to that. David is generous. This would have been one of his enemies. This is one of the people who stole their kids and wives and burned their village. He was a part of that. And how does David treat him? With compassion, with mercy, with generosity. David is generous towards him. And again, this points to God's providence, God's provision, because this man was part of the raiding team. And David says in verse 13, to whom do you belong and where are you from? He said, I am a young man of Egypt, servant to an Amalekite. And my master left me behind because I fell sick 3 days ago. We had made a raid against the Negeb and chariots which belongs to Judah, and against the Negeb of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire. And David said to him, will you take me down to this band? And he said, swear to me by God that you will not let me kill me or deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will take you down to this band. So David just sort of happens to run into the guy that knows where everybody is. It's God's provision again. The circumstances lead him to where he's supposed to go. And then we see they go to this place, and it says that they recovered everything. When they arrived there first, though, it says that all the people were spread out. They had just won this battle. So usually like an army is all together. They're hard to attack. They're ready to go. Everybody is spread out. Everybody's hammered. And nobody's paying attention. Right? This is when David shows up for battle. And if you go against battle, against people who are spread out, hammered, and not together, guess what makes it? A little easier to win. Okay? That's when he happens to show up. It's easy to attack the people. It's easy to rescue their people and get their goods. And then the emphasis of the whole thing is that it says that they recovered everything in verse 18. David recovered all the Amalekites had taken. Nothing was missing in verse 19, it says. David brought back all. David also captured all the flocks and herds, and the people drove the livestock before him, and they said, this is David's spoil. So David goes back, he rescues his people, he rescues their things, and he runs off the enemies. And they gave David all the credit. They called it David's spoil. And it seems like this should be like the climax of the story, right? Seems like it should be in there. Oh, look, they won. But it's not. It just keeps going. Because it wasn't David's spoil, and David understood that everything was from God. In his own strength, it said in verse 4 that David didn't even have any more strength even to weep. But we saw him turn to God, God provide for him, God care for him, God direct him. It's what allows us to be generous. David could be generous, we can be generous when we trust that God will provide for us. Why are people greedy? Why am I greedy? Why do we get greedy? Because we don't think we're going to have enough. We don't think God will provide. When we understand, as David did, everything was from God, that God promises to provide, that God promises that he'll never leave us or forsake us, that God promises that he will give us all that we need, it frees us up to be generous people. We can be generous with what we had because we know, one, it's from God anyway, and if we really need it, he'll provide for us more. We can be generous when we trust that God will provide. And what we saw in verses 7 to 20 is David was provided for. He provided everything. He gave him everything he had and more. And it allowed David to be gracious and generous towards others, which is what we see in verses 21 to 20 to 30. It seems like that, again, it should have been like the pinnacle, the climax, but it's kind of weird as you're reading through this passage. They keep talking about this brook. They keep talking about the brook of Besor, and they make a big deal about it every time, right? It was just like a little river that they stopped at and then went on to win the battle. But when they're going there, they emphasize it. They emphasize it. Sometimes in the scriptures, like whatever words used the most, like that's the point. The point is, though, that the word Besor, it means good news. It's literally the word for gospel. It's the word that God will provide for you. And it says that they came back, and they came to the men who were too exhausted to follow David. And it says, who had been left at the brook of Besor in verse 21. And it says they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with him. And again, we see two different responses to the people. It says that when David came near to the people, it says that he greeted them. It literally means he asked them about their well-being. It's the word for like shalom. It's the same word that Jesus, after he was crucified and he resurrected, and after all his disciples left him and left him alone, and then they see Jesus for the first time after his resurrection, and they're like, uh-oh, like he's back. We deserted him. And Jesus' first words to his disciples were, shalom, peace be with you. My peace I give to you in John 20. That's how David greets them. That's how Jesus greets us. David greets them and is concerned about their well-being. The group was worried about their own well-being. They did not want to share. It says, then all the wicked and worthless fellows among the men who had gone with David said, because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except that each may lead away his wife and children and depart. So we'll give them their wife and kids, and they get nothing else that we got. Peterson says that they become the dictators of the fairness policy. Now they're all about fairness now. But the Ziklags, that's who these people were. One comment said that they were disreputable. They were the ones that wanted to kill David. They weren't like great people. They would go with raids and destroy everything. And they had been extended the same grace. They had been extended the same generosity that David received from God. But they wanted to keep it all for themselves. They were about themselves. They were about their gain. Peterson says that everything they had experienced was sheer grace, just like with David. How could they talk about dividing things up fairly? God was treating them with marvelous and generous grace. Yet they wanted to be about what was fair. We can often do this as Christians. God extends his grace to us. God is compassionate to us. God is merciful to us. God provides for us. And then all of a sudden, we step apart. We look down. Can you believe those people? Can you believe what they do? No, like we're recipients of grace. We're extenders of grace. It says David would see to it that they treated one another with marvelous and generous grace. Those have been given grace, who God has been generous with, become people who are extenders of grace, who are generous with others. And that's what we see in David. David gives. And while the people called it David's spoil in verse 20, David knew it was from God. In verse 23, this might be, I don't think it's up there. It says, "You shall not do so, my brothers, with the way the Lord has given us. He has preserved us. He has given into our hand the band that came against us." This is all from God. You can't be greedy with it. And so David gives. He gives to the people who went to battle with them. He gives to the people who were left behind. And at the end, it's a weird thing. In verse 31, it says, in Hebron, that he gave for all the places where David and his men had roamed. So anybody that was affected by David and his life, he gave to. That was for their past provision. And also he was looking ahead because he was about to become king. And he was wise and he was generous with the people he dealt with. David understood that everything was from God, and so he was open-handed with it. He was generous with it. This past week, the kids had their dad's chapel with Alana and Weston, and so I came, and they do a little contest at the beginning, and so Miss Carly's like, hey, what? Weston does not love to be in front of people, and so we were the participants though. So it was me and Weston, and then another guy. A couple other guys, and the whole school was there. So it's like middle school and high school. It's like 700 people. And so Weston's mortified. Does it get any worse to be standing in front of 700 people with your dad? Right? So we have the contest, and they have to ask questions, and you had the red and the green if they got it right. And the deal was if you got a question right, you got 2 pieces of candy. And then every question you got right, you doubled it. And it was you're talking about the spoil? It was the spoil. It wasn't cheap candy. It was full-on bags of Skittles and Reese's and stuff that moms were no, don't eat it, right? They didn't care. They're the full bags, the good house at Halloween, right? And so we get to 2, and then there's these kids kind of right in front of us, and they were our helpers, right? Because I'm I don't know, does a shrimp have a brain? I'm I don't know if a shrimp has a brain. Does a shrimp have a brain? So they're helping us, right? So we get to 2, we get to 4, we get to 8, we get to 16 pieces of candy, right? And we're out. 16 is good enough. So I took some of the candy. Part of this was part parent. Part of this was I was studying this passage, and I start handing it to the kids who what? Helped us. Wasn't at first Dad, what are you doing? I'm dude, we would not be here with all this candy without them. So we gave the candy. Right? Weston could have kept all the candy. He would have been sitting alone, eating candy, feeling sick. There. What brought joy? Giving candy to others. He said, I did give, I guess, the prize candy, the one he really wanted. He gave it to some kid. And he's Dad, I had to watch him eat it all day. And all I wanted was one. Dude, you had 7 other pieces. You were fine. Right? That's what these people were doing. They wanted to hold on to it. They wanted to keep it to themselves. They wanted to give it to people who, quote unquote, deserved it. That's not how grace works. That's not what generosity in the scriptures is. We don't give it to anybody who deserves it. We didn't deserve anything. God extends his grace to us. David is a generous ruler. David is a generous king. And he's a generous ruler, and he's a generous king, primarily to point us to Jesus. David went and rescued the people. Jesus comes and rescues us. We didn't deserve to be rescued. We didn't do anything to be rescued. It says you were dead in your trespasses and sins. God made you alive together with Christ. Not because of your works that anybody should boast, but because he was rich in mercy. Jesus came to rescue us. It says that David didn't leave anybody behind. Jesus promises to not leave anybody behind who turns to him, who trusts in him, who knows they're going the other direction and comes back to him. Jesus gave himself on the cross. He gave everything. He poured it all out for us. Jesus promises to give us all things that he's earned. He promises to give us all things to his brothers and sisters who come to him. I loved it. There's a little phrase in verse 24. It says, they shall share alike. It doesn't matter how much you contribute, what you do, how prolific you are, what you think you accomplish for God or don't accomplish for God. The good news of the gospel is that we all share alike. Right? There's a little pithy Christian saying is that the ground is level at the foot of the cross. There's nobody better. There's nobody worse. We're all clothed in the righteousness of Christ. And Jesus freely gives. Ephesians 1 says that we're blessed with every spiritual blessing. It says that I will give you eternal life. It says that you are adopted as sons and daughters of the King. How do you know God will give you everything? Because he's the king, you're the son, you're the daughter. You have an inheritance. You're part of the family. Jesus promises, and he says that you will receive redemption and the forgiveness of sin. The scriptures say that if you don't know where to go, we even prayed it in our corporate prayer, that he will give us wisdom. He will give us understanding. 2 Corinthians 5 that says that you are a new creation. You have a new identity in Christ. Those things are all freely given to us by King Jesus. And when we know that God has given us all things, it's very simple to be generous with all that we have. So 3 quick takeaways, keys to becoming a generous people, to being a generous people. We need to live according to God's grace versus self-determination. Tim Keller puts it this way. He says, to the extent of our understanding of being recipients of grace, will we be agents of grace? To the extent of our understanding of being recipients of grace, will we be agents of grace? Jesus says to the woman, whoever is forgiven little loves little. Whoever is forgiven much loves much. You're forgiven, you're loved, you're a recipient of grace. Be an agent of grace. We'll only be generous when we understand that it's God's plunder and not our plunder. When it's God's spoil, not our spoil. David tells the people, you must not do that with what the Lord has given us. The view of what we have in the scriptures is that we're stewards of everything that is God's. It's all from him and it's all for him. Romans 11:36 says that understand that all things are from him and through him and for him. To him be the glory forever. When we understand that, we'll be generous. And the final key is that we would view things not as an avenue to gain, but as an avenue to give. This fits really well with those who go through the effects of the hurricane. It says that David gave to people like in the region, in the area. He didn't know all of them. The church is called to be a generous community. What is going to be distinct in a place that is very much about gain? Look around. What can I gain? What can I get? What can I keep? And the church is called to be a generous community in the midst of it. To generous to one another, to the body that we're a part of, to generous to all, not just the ones who contribute more or do more or seem to have more gifts. Generous to one another, generous to our enemies. I mean, think about David. This guy had taken all his stuff, burned down his place, and taken his wife and kids. And he's like, hey, here's some fig Newtons, right? Revive. Here's water. Let me care for you. They weren't fig Newtons, I'm sorry. They're just figs. He's generous. We talked about it last week, to our enemies. And then they're generous to the community around us. This is what the church is called to be. This is what our prayer would be. This is how we're going to point this community to Jesus. To be people who are recipients of grace and agents of grace. People who are recipients of God's generosity and agents of God's generosity. Let's pray.